Way. So I want to welcome everyone this morning to this presentation for INCERN members. I am privileged to be able to bring this to you today. As you all know, cyber terrorism is growing at an alarming rate, and I just heard this morning, as a matter of fact, that the city of Baltimore has been crippled by a cyber terrorist attack that's been going on for several days, but it is crushing to the city of Baltimore. And it's just one of 20 such attacks that have hit municipalities over the past year. And actually, healthcare providers are more likely to be targeted than any other business. CSO reported that healthcare providers were twice as likely to be victims of cyber attack than any other industry. So Steve Long, who is the president and CEO at Hancock Regional Hospital, is with us today. He faced the reality of a cyber attack last year. So I asked him if he would come on and share his experience with our members. And I wanted you to hear not just what they tell you on the press, but what it's really like. And Steve tells his story in a very unique manner. So before I hand this off to Steve, there were a few points about his presentation that the journey he experienced through his attack that I really wanted to share with you. And first of all, the generosity of his time. I can't say enough about that. Steve has been incredibly generous with his time, speaking to many organizations. He has been a presenter at 4 of our Indiana MGMA conferences this year throughout the state, and he is also speaking at our 2019 Indiana MGMA annual conference in July. Not to mention, he was just featured on 60 Minutes earlier this month. So I think Steve owes me some action on all these speaking gigs I'm getting him, but the 60 Minutes show was very good. They had a lot of people to interview, so I wish they would have had Steve on for the whole thing, but they only have so much time. The second thing is the humble manner in which Steve shares his stories. I think many leaders would find it difficult to have the public exposure that they did, but Steve's humility in the way he presents is strongly to be admired. And finally, it's the sense of transparency, which is a lesson I think we can all learn. Many organizational leaders have been faced with the crisis of one type or another, and they've tried to hide from it and duck under the radar of the press, or they just try to go forward with business as usual. But I think you want to wait to the end of this, and you'll see how Steve made a completely different approach and displayed a very skillful lesson in leadership, which I admire strongly. So with that said, and with much appreciation, I want to welcome Steve Long, President and CEO at Hancock Regional Hospital, and a sincere thank you for taking your time to be with us this morning and share your story. So I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
All right, not at all. Well, thank you very much for that really kind introduction. I'm not deserving of those words, and as you'll see as I talk through our experience, it really was all about the team we had and the people that we brought in to help us. So it was not me by any means. In fact, I think my role was to really kind of stay out of the way. So with that, I'm actually going to try to share my screen with the presentation for us. So here we go. And let me see, you are more skilled at this than I. Can you all see that? Hey, Phil, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. Are you seeing the whole screen?
Yes, it looks like the full screen is visible.
Okay, good deal. So we call this surviving the cyber-apocalypse. It's a word I think we coined. We're probably going to have to trademark that baby at some point because it's kind of getting well known out there, because we have been on the road for the last year talking to people about the experience that we had. And it is for a couple of reasons. One is that, as Phil had mentioned, there's just not a lot of people that talk about this. And so there's not a lot of information out there for you to go and glean about what this might look like and what you might do. And the other one is that we really have a story to tell, and we want folks to know what actually happened and what we did, and then some tips on how you can either survive the cyber apocalypse of your own if you would have to, or prevent it from happening, which would be the best. So let me just start with a little bit of background about who we are. We're Hancock Health, Hancock Regional Hospital. We're located in Greenfield, which is just east of Indianapolis. Our service area is really kind of that east central Indiana area, although it's primarily in Hancock County. You can look at this slide. This is a picture of our main campus. We, of course, have locations all over our county. We're not huge, but we're also not small. And the key figure here is that we bill out about $1 million a day. And that will become important as we talk about the experience that we had and the fact that we do have locations kind of scattered about, and all of them have computers that are hooked up to our network. So keep some of those things in mind. So I'm going to walk us through these 6 things as we kind of have our time together today, and this will guide the conversation that we have. So let me tell you what it was like in the beginning, and I will be fully transparent here and say that I'm a CEO and I have CEO disease. And that is that I am not always right, but I'm rarely uncertain. And so I kind of believe what I believe. And I looked at our preparation for an incident like this, and I had always felt pretty good. And frankly, I would read about these stories in the journals, and I would say, oh, those poor folks, I'm sure happy that that's never going to happen to us. But I thought we were pretty well prepared. And, you know, in hindsight and talking to a lot of people around the country, we actually were pretty averagely to maybe just a bit above averagely prepared. I mean, we were most wired 3 years in a row. We had a comprehensive privacy and security program. We had very strong support for our privacy program and our security program from the board and from the C-suite. And we did things, you know, we participated in KnowBe4, so we send out those phishing emails, you know, we try to trap ourselves into things, and we had our network inspected on a regular basis. We had everything in place, we believe. But let me tell you about that particular night. This was January 11th of 2018. And if you recall, last year, as it was this year, was a season that we had a lot of flu patients. And we were packed to the brim in our practices and urgent care in the hospital and the ER. We had actually been on diversion a couple of times during that flu season, as had most of the hospitals in central Indiana at one time or the other. We were heading into a holiday weekend, so the following Monday, this was on a Thursday, and the following Monday was going to be a holiday where the banks were closed. So also an important thing to remember as we go forward. And there was a snowstorm on the way. And we were looking at anywhere from 4 to 6, maybe more inches of snow and a blizzard. And so we had prepared for kind of a weather emergency. So we had folks that were sleeping overnight in the hospital and at local hotels, and we had printed off the patient list to make sure that we would be able to call folks if we had to cancel some of our clinics. So all of this kind of comes together as understanding where we were. And I will tell you that there are some providential aspects to this. That level of preparation, the timing of all of this happening and how quickly it happened, it was actually really quite providential. So here's what actually happened. It was that Thursday evening. It was about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. I was at home, frankly, getting ready for bed. I have grandchildren, and the older I get, the earlier I have to go to bed. And I got a call from our administrator on call, who was our CFO, and he called me up and he said, hey, there's something wrong with a computer in the lab, and there's something on the screen. And I said, is it something I should worry about? He said, no, probably not. We're going to get it figured out. And we have a secure messaging system that allows our clinicians to talk to each other, kind of like secure texting is what it is. It's called Diagnose. And I began to get copied on messages from our nursing staff to the chief nurse saying, hey, there's something wrong with our computers up here. They're running kind of slow. And I thought, okay, this is not a good thing. So I got up, got dressed, and went in. And what I found when I got to the hospital is that our IT staff were already well underway and looking at screens that looked like this one. And we've kind of blurred it out so you can't see some of the links because you wouldn't want to go to those links. But essentially what this message said is that your system has been encrypted. And if you would like the decryption keys to unencrypt your system or decrypt it, you've got 1 week to do that. And if you want to buy those, that would be 4 Bitcoin, which at the time was about $50,000. And if you don't pay us within a week, then we're going to just permanently encrypt all of your files and you'll be done. So I walked into my own office and I looked at my computer, and all of the file names had changed. In fact, these little clippings here are from my computer. So the file names were changed to sorry for files or .we apologize. And you couldn't open any of them. And I thought for a very brief moment, maybe these folks aren't too bad because they said they were sorry. And then, of course, you remember that they have encrypted your entire network. So this is what it looked like for us, and it had infected every computer that we have. So I can tell you, as we went into this incident, there were about 3 guiding principles. And it is not like we sat down and said, hey, what should our guiding principles be? We actually just kind of have these as guiding principles all the time in our organization. So first one was patient safety. And you can imagine I had these visions that I would walk into the hospital and find that there was ransomware on our IV pumps. And that was not the case, thankfully. And I am concerned about that for the future for all of us, though, as we get more connected with our peripherals and our devices, that the Internet of Things is going to allow this kind of thing to happen, even on those patient-facing devices. Fortunately for us, that was not the case. The second thing was security of patient information. So I had these visions that our patient information was already somewhere out on the dark web and being sold, and they were already dickering over it. So that was the second thing. And then finally was, how quickly can we get this thing back up and running? Because again, we're a full service hospital. We have a lot of patients that we take care of, and we bill out $1 million a day. So time was of the essence as we went into this. So we really had about 5 response steps. I'm going to walk us through these. And the first one was activating the disaster plan. Now, as I talk, I'm going to give you some of the lessons that we've learned in the process. And the first thing we did when I got there, and in fact, they had already started the process when I got there, is we thought, well, this is a virus. It's propagating its way through the system. And so probably what we need to do is just shut everything off so that we can stop it right where it's at. So we went through and manually shut off every single one of our more than 1,200 computers. And that meant that we had to go to all of our outlying sites. We sent our plan out guys out there and said, shut them all off. And then we posted signs that said, please don't turn your computer back on because we don't know what's happening yet. So that was the first thing. I will tell you though, in hindsight, and talking with the forensic IT company and the FBI, they say maybe don't actually shut them all down, because if you shut your computers down, you lose some of the history that would be very helpful in identifying exactly what that virus is. So there's one of the lessons learned. We then stood up our incident command center, and that's right here in our administrative office. And we did a couple of things. So the first thing we did is we sat there and we looked at each other and we said, who clicked the link, right? Because this usually happens because somebody clicked the link in a phishing email. And we looked at each other, said, who clicked the link? I didn't click the link. Did you click the link? Well, in fact, nobody clicked the link, and I'll tell you what actually happened in a moment. And then we began the process of figuring out what to do, because our entire outside connection, electronic connection with the outside world, was limited to my laptop computer, a hotspot on my phone, and my personal email address. That was what we had to start with. So I would encourage you, as another lesson learned, as you really are preparing for a disaster like this, sit in your command center and just figure out what you would do if you had no computers at all. So the first thing that I wanted to do is tell my board, of course, because they're my bosses, and I walked into my office to the place where I keep all that information, which was on my computer, which of course was encrypted. And so we were sitting there thinking, all of these things we take for granted, we can't anymore. And so we began to recognize that we had resources that we didn't realize. So I had already mentioned Diagnotes. It's the secure messaging system, and it is not resident on our system. So it actually resides on an outside network. So we had full access. We also had Board Effect, the board portal, and that had all of the information I was looking for because it was loaded in and it also was hosted elsewhere. And then we had a system whereby we communicate with our employees in disasters like this, and it's called Live Process. So on the positive side, it also does not reside on our network. On the negative side, when we set it up, it gave the employees a choice of their email address, their cell phone number, or their home phone in order to be contacted. So for instance, when we have fires, we will have that system automatically propagate to all of us and saying, hey, there's a fire drill. And wouldn't you know that most people had actually chosen their email address as the way they wanted to be notified, and email was gone. So fortunately, we got in, we switched everybody over to their cell phone, and we began to have the ability to communicate with our employees through Live Process. So another lesson learned is you ought to catalog all of these resources that you have out there that you don't think about in a time like this. All these things that are out there. The second thing is that we went into downtime procedures. Now, we all have this, and we usually do it at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning because there's very few people around at that time. And it's when we do our upgrades to the system. And that's typically how it is. Usually it's an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours tops. And we all have the paper that we fall back on when we need to go into downtime. Well, here is the interesting thing. So after we had ensured that our patient-facing equipment was not affected, we moved everybody to paper documentation. And then we were on it for a while. In fact, in the end, we were on it for about 3 days. And wouldn't you know, we have a whole lot of young nurses that have never done anything with paper other than a couple of hours of downtime. And they were a bit lost. And for those of you that are old like I am, you may remember the days when we had the flow charts or the the flow sheets where you could document almost everything on a day on one piece of paper. But we don't do that, of course, anymore. It is basically a piece of paper for every screen that you would have inside of the EMR. So at the end of our journey, we had 10,000 sheets of paper. So another thing to think about is how you document on paper for more than a couple of hours. And then we did go on diversion for a short period of time in the ER. And I'll tell you, it was because of our PACS system. So the malware had gotten onto the PACS system, so we had to shut it off. And that meant that we could not send images to our offsite radiologists. They sit at Community North here in Indianapolis. So fortunately, we have an extraordinary radiology group, and they sent a radiologist, and that person, a couple of people were actually on site with us 24/7 until PACS got up on the following Sunday night. And they could actually read the images on the imaging equipment. So something for you to know is that there is the ability to do that on your imaging equipment. And then I would have to tell you that we just remained a hospital. We never stopped being a hospital. We had babies that were born and surgeries that were done, and we admitted people to the hospital and discharged them and had ER visits. And the lesson learned here is that hospitals are not computers. Hospitals are people taking care of people. And we never ceased doing that the entire time. So then we then did probably one of the smartest things that we did, and that was figure out that we were not smart enough to do this on our own. And we phoned a friend. And we pulled out our disaster response plan, and one of the first things it said there is contact Hall Render. And they are the ones that have experience in this. So we did, and fortunately they answered the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning. And they immediately put us into touch with an IT forensics company. It's called Pondurance. So if you're interested, if you know where the IHA, the Indiana Hospital Association offices are, in that same building, Hall Render and Pondurance also sit. So it's pretty handy for us, actually. So they engaged them with us, and we established how often we were going to talk to each other through this whole thing. As we went through the recovery, we decided it was about every 2 hours. Any more than that was just too much, couldn't get work done. Any less than that, and you couldn't keep each other up to date. And then we made the decision to involve the FBI. And many people wonder about that. Why would you bring in the FBI? But truly, it is because the FBI knows how this all works. And they understand what it takes to get through something like this. And I will tell you, unlike what you see on TV, these are really nice guys. They're very smart. They know what they're doing, and they don't take over. They give you advice. They investigate. They give you their insights into the situation. They tell you what might happen in different scenarios. So we were very happy that we got in touch with them. And then we initiated the forensic investigation. So we had to figure out what in the world actually happened. And there are 4 stages to that, and our IT forensics guy could tell you much more about this, but basically, it's kind of like medicine, right? You got to figure out what happened, so identify it. Then you have to contain it, so you have to contain it so it can't go any farther, and then you have to kill it. So you contain it, you kill it, and then you bring everything back up. And as we have been around the country talking to folks about this, what we find is that there are places that don't go through all of these stages. And what they do is they will identify it, they won't really contain it, they won't really eradicate it, and they try to bring their system back up and reinfect themselves. So really important that you do all 4 of these if you get in a situation like this. Phoning a friend is the key thing that you got to do here. So what actually happened? And here's what happened for us. And fortunately, we had exceptional logs. So we had a trail through our computer system that told us exactly what happened every step of the way. And what happened is that we had a server, and that server had an open remote desktop protocol port. So the way what that means is that if you're out on the internet and you know really what you're doing and you're scanning the network, you can see that this is a port you can get into if you have a login ID and a password. So it's not like you could just get into the system. You had to have a login ID and a password. Well, the people that were attacking us found this as they're scanning networks out there, and they put us on the list and said, let's try these ones. And so we have the logs that show that they tried to get in through brute force, kind of like what you see on TV. And that's where they have this computer that generates, millions of passwords and IDs and tries to come up with the right combination. So we saw that they tried to brute force their way in, and it did not work. And then they stopped, and then they logged in. They actually had a login ID and a password that worked. And we later found that that was actually the login ID and a password for a vendor. And this vendor's credentials had been compromised, and they were for sale on the dark web. Here's another lesson learned, is you really got to understand not only what you're doing with your own login credential hygiene, but also those of your vendors. So these bad actors went out and they bought the password and the login ID. They logged into the system and they were able to map it out very quickly. And we could see exactly what they did in hindsight because we had it logged. We saw that they didn't create accounts. They didn't move around within the network. They just mapped it out to see where they needed to put the virus. And we also saw that they didn't take anything off of the networks. They didn't look at anything. They didn't take anything off. Really what they were trying to do was just encrypt it so that they could ask us for payment. And in fact, the FBI told us that that's exactly what this particular variant of ransomware does. They're after the money, and frankly, they ask for a reasonable amount. And I'll tell you why that is in a moment. So the question then is, they got in, they encrypted our network, and we only have a couple of choices then. One would be, can you just wipe your system clean and restore from backups? Or is it a better idea to just pay the money and purchase the decryption keys or pay the ransom? And I can tell you, when you talk to the FBI, they're always going to say, don't pay a ransom. That is exactly what they will always say. I will tell you, behind the scenes, you can ask them the question and say, well, what do you think would happen if we did? And they will give you their honest insights into that. But it is really dependent on your situation. So do you really have backups? Are your backups out there? Are they good? Are they current? Are they restorable? How long does it take? So I had this vision in my mind because we put millions of dollars into a secure backup facility. And I thought there was like some big red switch on the wall that you'd walk over and flip it and suddenly everything was back, right? Because I have CEO disease. And what I learned, of course, is that is not the case. There is no big red switch to flip. And so it takes a long time to restore from backups. And often backups, because they're compressed, don't restore all that well. So it is important to know that whether you have backups or not, and then if those backups really are going to be good. So we looked at all of this and we said, well, how long is it going to take? And we believed it was going to take a long time to restore from backups. And I will tell you, because of the situation we were in, we were really not sure at the beginning if we had backups. Now, later we learned that we did. So all of our EMR backups were there. We just didn't know it at the time. So then let's suppose that you decide to pay. Then the question is, what does that mean? Do you make yourself a target for things like this in the future? Well, certainly. The word will get around that you actually paid a ransom. You paid the money. And what does that mean for you? What if you pay the money and then you don't get your decryption keys? Or what if you give them the money and they say, well, actually, we know we asked for 4 of these Bitcoins, but we want 6 now. Well, the interesting thing is that usually doesn't matter because they have integrity. And I do that with air quotes because it is kind of reliant on that. And the reason is that if they are going to try to get money from the next person, they have to make sure that they follow through on what they said they're going to do. So if they are going to have you buy the decryption keys, they have to give them to you and they have to work. We've actually talked to folks around the country that they bought the decryption keys and they didn't all work. And so they get back in touch with the hackers and they would say, oh, we're sorry, here, try these. And they keep giving them keys until they actually work. So oddly enough, there is a business model that goes along with this and they tend to rely on it. So all of these things fall into the decision of whether you pay or not to pay. And we decided in the end to pay, that was going to be the best way out for us in this situation. So when you decide to pay, then you have to figure out, okay, Bitcoin. They want Bitcoin. I had no idea what Bitcoin was. I mean, I'd heard about it on TV, but it is not a straightforward process to go out there and find Bitcoin. You have to get it from somebody that actually owns it. You have to have a Bitcoin wallet. You have to have the transaction happen, and it actually happens here on the dark web. Well, what's the dark web? It's actually just the internet. It's uncatalogued sites. So you can't get to the dark web from Google, but you can from Tor, which is just simply the onion router. That's the website or the web browser you use to access the dark web. I would recommend don't do it. But we had to do this in order to make the transaction. And they gave us very specific instructions. We followed them very closely. We had it up on a screen in the administrative conference room. And our IT forensics company and our attorneys were helping us the whole time. In fact, they were doing the work for us. And it's not instantaneous. It takes a little while. And I will tell you again, you may remember I said that this was a holiday weekend. Well, the key learning there is that if we didn't get the transaction for the Bitcoin done by 4 o'clock on Friday, it wasn't going to happen until the next Tuesday. We had to get the Bitcoin in our hand, our virtual hand, I guess, by 4 o'clock that day. We did, and then we did the transaction to get the decryption keys in the late hours on Friday evening. In fact, it was about 2 o'clock on Saturday morning when we actually got the decryption keys. And then you got to say, okay, so you get the decryption keys. Is it one key that unlocks everything? Is it a whole bunch? I will tell you that we got 1,400, and we had to then figure out which decryption key went to which server or which computer, and we were able to figure it out, but it was not fast. A lot faster than trying to restore from backup, but it is not a truly speedy process. And of course, you got to make sure that the decryption keys are solid and they don't reinfect you as well. So we've got all of this, and we know then that we have got the decryption keys. They actually work. We began to decrypt our system. And then you begin to think, okay, what are the repercussions about this? What are the ramifications? And of course, there's a legal component, and the state has laws and the feds have laws that potentially apply. And at the state level, they say, well, was there identity theft? And I can tell you that after a lot of talking with the state attorney general, it was determined that there was no risk of that. And it was because we had great logs. We knew exactly what happened the whole time. And then there's also, of course, with the OCR, the HIPAA privacy rules. Was there a breach? And I will tell you that HIPAA presumes a breach when you have a ransomware attack. But they give you the ability to look at how bad it was, essentially. And you can overcome that presumption if you can document that there's a low probability that your PHI was actually compromised. And we were able to do that because of our extraordinary logs. We knew exactly what had happened. And I think the key phrase here is that you have to have evidence that nothing was done rather than no evidence that nothing was done, right? I mean, you have to positively say, we have the ability to track and see what happened here. There was a very low probability that anything happened. So we were able to successfully navigate those rules. Okay, so let me switch gears a little bit here and say, that's kind of what happened. I'll wrap up what happened to us here in a moment, but I want you to know that you can do things to prepare for an incident like this. So number one, you got to have an incident response plan. Make sure you have that in place, and then make sure that you practice it. And then when you look at how you're going to respond, there are certain characteristics that you need to have in this response team. Now, ours was our IT folks, in fact, everybody at Hancock Health and the folks at Endurance, the IT forensics company, and then Hall Render as well. So availability, you got to drop everything. And I can tell you that even a man of my advanced age can stay awake for 42 hours straight with the appropriate amount of Mountain Dew. And it really works. So you have to have complete dedication. You got to have no ego. If you have an ego going into this, especially for your IT team, then you're going to crash and burn. You have to understand it's a matter of getting through it and getting it done. You got to trust the team. I mean, believe me, I'm a little bit techie, but I'm not that techie. And you got to trust your people. You can't do it by yourself. And we had to recognize immediately that we needed help. And we reached out to Ponderance and Hall Render. And then you have to be truthful. I mean, hey, there were things that happened that should not have happened. I mean, that port shouldn't have been open. And you have to be truthful in this whole thing and just own up to it. So practice. Remember when I said we started this whole incident and we had my cell phone, my computer, and my personal email address? Practice that. Sit in your room and just practice what that's like. Get cyber liability insurance and make sure that you can utilize the people you want to. So the second call that we made was actually to our cyber liability insurance company. And we called them up and said, hey, here's what's happening. And actually, that's what we were going to say, except the fact is they didn't answer the phone. It just rang and rang and rang. We tried them a half a dozen times. And they never did answer the phone. Finally, we just sent an email and said, well, here's what we're doing. We hope that you're okay with that. And about 10 hours into it, they finally called us back and they said, we're real sorry. Something was wrong with the phones. And we said, well, that's okay. Here's what we're doing. And they said, well, just stop right there because the people that you're using are not empaneled with us. So this is not really going to work. And we thought for about 5 seconds and said, well, we're already down the road with these guys, so we're not going to stop. So I guess maybe you're just not going to cover us then. Fortunately, in the end, they did cover us. And make sure that your coverage is adequate as well. And then make sure that you have liability protections in your vendor contracts. And you can imagine that the conversations we had with the vendors that, or the vendor that had their login credentials stolen, that was an interesting conversation. So make sure that you have this written into your contracts. This should just go without saying, but make sure that you have logging turned on. on your system, because if you don't have that logging, you have no way to prove what actually happened. And probably the biggest lesson right here is that if you have a place that doesn't work well on a good day, it is really not going to work well on a bad day. So make sure that your fundamental day-to-day organizational dynamics are good. So here we go. How do you lessen the likelihood of an incident? Well, as you might have figured out already, you got to have that enterprise-wide risk analysis. So you got to make sure that you're looking at your system, make sure you have a plan in place that you can pull out and phone a friend. Make sure that you have all of the patches. I mean, this is a pain, right? Because every Monday night, I think it is, we patch our system. So I come in, and I'm one of those terrible guys that leaves things up overnight. And so I come in on a Tuesday morning, like yesterday, Tuesday morning, and my computer needs to be restarted because we did patches. And even though it's a pain and a frustration, you got to do it. Multi-factor authentication, we now do this. So if we're logging into the system from outside, it has to use your cell phone. And a vendor management program. You have to manage the people that are gaining access. And there are some that have to have 24/7 access. There's just no way around it. And then here was probably one of the biggest things that I learned, and that is that when they attacked us with a ransomware variant called SamSam. And our system, our anti-malware, antivirus system, actually recognized SamSam and it shut it down. But because there were human beings on the other end attacking us, and we just had software protecting us, the human beings changed the virus, and it went right past our ransomware detector. And that was the lesson, is that you got to have human beings on your side protecting you as well. So we now have that. We actually have a place down in Honduras where they're watching over our network 24/7. Never stop training your workforce. Those phishing emails are getting more and more elegant, I would say, and easier and easier to click them because you think they're real. Make sure you keep training your folks, because that's the way most people get into your system. And then get third-party penetration testing. You got to test your network all the time. We had before, and it did not catch this one vulnerability that we had. So here's the kind of the resolution to our entire endeavor. It started on a Thursday evening, and we worked through the night, Friday and Saturday and Sunday. And by Monday morning, most of our core systems were back up and running. And we had burned all those signs that we had put on the wall saying, don't turn your computer back on. And within a couple of weeks, everything was back. There is one thing that we didn't get back, and we had a couple of Exchange servers that were in the process of backing up when this all happened. And what that meant is that they were completely destroyed in the whole process. So there were people here that lost their calendar. Now you can imagine, I live with my Outlook calendar, and it would be devastating, but actually just a little bit freeing to not know what you're supposed to be doing today and tomorrow. So we did lose that through this whole ordeal. The last couple of things I'd share with you is you got to expect the unexpected. So imagine, if you will, this thing's happened on a Thursday night, and Friday about noon, I get a call from the publisher of the local newspaper. And he said, hey, you remember when you got here a few years back where I said that there may be a time when we publish an article that you might not like, but that I would always call you in advance and tell you? Yeah. And he said, well, we hear there's something happening with your computers. And so we made a very quick decision to be very transparent about this whole thing, even though it was very early in the process. So the reporters came in and they're talking to me and they're asking questions. And as I'm answering, they're saying, well, this sounds a lot like Grey's Anatomy. Well, I had no idea what they were talking about. I mean, I work in a hospital. I don't need to watch it on TV. But they're saying, yeah, the last episode of the season was all about the ransomware attack on Grace Sloan Memorial Hospital. And I thought, okay, well, whatever. So we did the interview and we kept working through our process. And then on Saturday, I finally got to go home and get some rest. And I woke up and I thought, I probably should watch that episode just to see what they were talking about. So I'm watching it, and sure enough, there's this screen and it says your systems have been encrypted and here's the ransom. And I thought, well, that seems familiar. And, very worried people looking at computer screens also look pretty familiar. But then the FBI showed up and there's like 12 of them and they took over the hospital. I thought, well, this is not right. And then there was blood and people died. And I thought, well, this is not it at all. And then there was a $20 million ransom. And I thought, oh my God, people are going to think that that's what happened here. So always expect the unexpected and be prepared to tell the truth of the story. So you can imagine our local newspaper ran the story, and it was picked up by the Indy Star, and it was picked up by USA Today. and it was picked up by CBS News. And then it was picked up by virtually everybody on the internet. I even got a call from a friend who was on vacation in Jamaica. And he said, "Hey, what's going on?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Oh, I saw it on the news." I said, "You saw it on the news in Jamaica?" And it culminated in this little figure at the bottom where he's the ransomware guy with his mask on and our hospital logo and then the front door of our hospital in the background. And what do you do? What do you do when that's there? Well, I tell you what we did, because we had gotten through the incident by then. So we celebrated. We had shirts made that said, "I survived the CyberApocalypse of 2018 and all I got was this silly t-shirt." And then we had other t-shirts made that were Hancock strong, because it was the strength of the team that really got us through this really in a phenomenally short period of time. And so all of us working together were very, very strong as we did this. So that is a brief overview of what we've done. And I would be happy to take any questions that you might have now. And I think, Phil, that I just need to do the stop share here, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
fine, Steve. And I am opening up microphones now. So for anyone who has questions, now's a great opportunity to be able to tap into Steve's wisdom and knowledge and his learning experience. So we will take questions at this time.
Phil, I have a question. This is Jim Miller.
Yeah, Jim.
Actually, I have three for Mr. Long. First of all, thank you, sir, for your time, and not only with this webinar, but all going around the state and telling your story. I think it's very helpful and very much appreciated by our industry.
Well, thank you.
First of all, the 60 Minutes piece talked a little bit about the 50,000 K kind of limit that they're putting on these ransoms. Could you talk a little bit about why that is at 50K? And secondly, is it common in the industry or not just healthcare, but just in business in general to have some type of cybersecurity insurance policy to offset some of the cost that you incurred as a result of this? And thirdly, what was Scott Pelley like?
Well, let me answer that third one first. So I had never met Scott Pelley, and he turns out to be really kind of a delightful guy. And we had a great conversation. Now, they were with us for a day and a half, and that ended up in a minute and a half on the air. But he was a neat guy, asked really good questions, walked in with 25 questions already built. And they clearly had a kind of an agenda they were shooting for that you saw in their airing. And that is that, you're faced with this decision. Do you pay the ransom or do you not pay the ransom? And they gave a couple of examples of places that did and then one that didn't. And, truly it is a business continuity decision. It's based on the facts of the case, but it often makes sense just to pay that ransom and buy the decryption keys. And I can tell you, the reason that they are charging about 50,000 is because it's not too much and it's not too little. They have a business model that's out there. And in fact, they have a whole business process they go through. And they're looking for specific types of vulnerabilities. So we happen to have one. They're looking for specific types of organizations, ones that are not too big and also not too small, and that can afford that $50,000 payment. Now, for us, we did turn that into our cyber liability insurance policy, and that was covered. Now, we had a very large deductible. I can tell you that our total cost for getting through this thing all in was about $300,000. And we had a $250,000 deductible. So we got a little bit back from that. But I would say that cyber insurance is becoming much more common now because the number of times this is happening is increasing. And I think that we're going to see that increase more as we all become increasingly connected. And I do have concerns for the future for healthcare, especially with all of the peripheral devices we're loading onto our networks and the vulnerabilities that might bring. And that within healthcare, we don't do a great job, and this is the medical device industry. They don't do a great job of upgrading to the newest computer technology. There are systems out there that are really quite old and they're still in use.
Steve, this is Phil, and thanks for those questions, Jim. Appreciate that. Steve, at one of our, I think it was in a South Bend event, you spoke about your ability to watch the cash once you paid. The ability to watch that travel around the globe. Can you shed some insight on that?
Yeah, you bet. So the way that that Bitcoin works is it's an entirely electronic currency. So there's nothing physical about it at all. So it has to be verified in order to make sure that it's real. And it goes through this system. It's called blockchain. And the blockchain requires anywhere from 3 to 6 computers to be accessed in series in order to validate that this is real money. And it takes a while, and you kind of watch it happen. And it can be validated at one computer here in America and another one in another place around the world. And 3, 4, 5, 6 times later, you finally get to the end and it said, yes, this is a valid transaction. So it is not a quick process, and you can watch it on your computer if you ever want to do that. I mean, it's a little bit boring, but when you're in the midst of a situation like ours, it's kind of fascinating to watch. But it is not like you just write a check or pay something with a credit card. There is a process that it goes through.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask also, you said that when you were finally able to establish contact with the insurance company, they told you to halt. So you've got the FBI walking you through one day or one direction with Pondurance, and you've got your insurance carrier on the other side. That had to be a kind of an EKG spiking moment when you have that. So how do you assess priority? Who takes precedence in that situation where insurance, which is going to be your financial viability on one side, giving you opposite direction from legal authorities or the consultants that you're paying? How did you decide which way to go?
Yeah, so for us, and the first thing I'll say is that this is why it's so important to talk to your insurance carrier to see who they've been paneled to help you out, both from the legal side and the forensic IT side. So know in advance who those people are, and make sure that if you have a preference that you have expressed that to your company, that those people are impaneled. That way you don't have to go through it. For us, though, we were already about 7 or 8 hours, maybe even a little bit more into this, and we were on a path. And from our perspective, this was going to be a path that was going to be difficult to jump off of. And we didn't know the companies that they were talking about, and the ones we were using, Hallrender and Pondurance, are local, and we had a high level of trust in them. So it wasn't a hard decision for us to make. And frankly, part of this is we had not been through it. We didn't really know what the whole financial cost was going to be. But in our estimation, it was more important to continue on the path and get it over with quickly, and then just fight it out with the insurance company afterwards. Okay. I can tell you they really did help us out in the end, and those companies are now impaneled for us.
Excellent. Well, that's a good point for all of our members to make sure you record that as you work on your preparation plans, that in the event you have the FBI engaged or a firm like Pondurance, make sure your insurance company is aware of that in advance and try to coordinate the structure of authority and who's going to be under whose control in that situation, so that you're not forced into an immediate decision like Steve was at the time. Other questions? Has anybody been through similar circumstances where you want to share anything? Or?
Well, hi, this is Tammy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Tammy, how you doing? Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Steve, one question. Woodlawn, where I work, went through a similar thing around the same time. And what we noted was several months before, we had a small cyber hit where they were just testing. It was like a small 50 Bitcoin type of thing. Did you also experience a test mode before they did the full-blown, here we've got you attack?
Because we had such good logs, we were able to look back several months, and we could see where they were trying to hit us in the past, and that's some of that thing where we were talking about the brute forcing. So we saw that they were bumping up against that port in the past, but they had not done anything significant until this actual attack.
Yeah, we had a couple of failed attempts too, but one did get through, and like I said, it was just a very small amount, but we thought, oh, okay, one and done, we should be good, and started implementing more precautions, but before everything was rolled out, they got us.
Yeah, and I'll tell you that I had mentioned the thing that our anti-malware and antivirus was signature-based at the time, and we have now gone to a system called Cylance, and it's kind of artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't look for particular signatures, it looks for patterns. And we feel much, much more comfortable with that now because as we have learned, if you have software that's watching over you and it's based on somebody else already being hit, then it leaves you vulnerable.
It kind of makes you feel like you had a hurricane come through. And I totally agree with you, having been or currently being a very senior nurse. I never wear a watch that doesn't have a second hand, but back to the days of longhand charting, staff were like, what am I supposed to do? Grab a piece of paper, put your date and time down, and start documenting. I don't do that. And it's like, well, okay, welcome to the real world. Today you are, and this is what you need. And I will tell you, the other thing that we learned was, we have a lot of satellite offices and stuff, that the hospital stayed current with downtime forms, but we weren't really good with sharing that with our offices. So one of the first things, okay, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? Nope, never heard of, never saw. So we were actually making copies of the hospital and then delivering them to sites so they could have those downtime forms to be able to keep doing business.
And it is a very good point. And we were fortunate, again, this happened on that Friday when there was a blizzard, so our clinics were not busy at all.
Yeah.
We recognized that this was going to be a problem as well. And it was yet another reason why we wanted to get through it very quickly, because we knew on Monday we were going to open back up for full business in the clinics, and we were not quite sure how we were going to do it.
Right. I you know, I have to commend your staff, as I do Woodlawn, because they were champs. I mean, absolute rock stars, good questions that use the patients. The one thing I really noticed was the immense customer service skills between workers and with the patients that were coming in.
You know, it's an amazing thing, because I talked to a number of our patients who had been here over that weekend. And afterwards I said, what did you notice? How was it? And they said, we didn't even know it was happening.
Yeah.
So it was pretty transparent to them. You know, I do want to comment on one thing you were saying about the watch, that I have a couple of grandsons, they're 3 and 6. And my 6-year-old grandson doesn't know how to read an analog watch. Last week, they're actually taking all of the analog clocks out of the classrooms. So they're not even going to learn how to do it anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good question, Tammy. Thank you very much for sharing that. And that brings up a good point. I know many of our members, you have the main hospital, but at the same time, you've got physician practices out in outlying areas of your hospital community, as well as rural health clinics. So it's critical that you share the action plan from the moment this goes down, that everybody in all of those locations know what to do. And as Steve learned, make sure you have everybody's cell numbers written down, the old-fashioned way, where we actually write it on a form somewhere so that we can read it, because when your cell phones are disabled because your Outlook is connected, it's tough. And probably not a bad idea to print calendars out occasionally. I know I work with some colleagues at Steve's hospital, and working with them for several months after this was a challenge for them, because we would try to coordinate meetings for various events, and it was difficult for them because their calendar was challenged. Steve, one of our members submitted a question, wanted to know, how were you able to verify that patient data was never accessed?
So that was with the logging. And I can't stress how important this is, that you have to have the logging turned on so that we knew exactly what was happening all of the time. So we were able to measure how long they were in the network. We were able to see exactly where they went, what they did and did not look at. So we were able to verify that they not only did not take anything off of the network because we had that logging turned on, and we also could verify that the places that they went, they couldn't view any of the things as well. So without the logging, very different story.
Okay, excellent. One last question for me, Steve, then I'll shut up. What was the community response? I mean, I so much admire the way you came public with things and you made a celebration of it. What was your take and your assessment on the community response after the dust settled?
You know, it was by and large very, very positive. And part of that transparency is that a few days after it happened, I actually wrote an article. And if you want to see it, it's still sitting on our website. So if you go to our website, hancockregional.org, and just search for the word cyber, you're going to find the article I wrote.
Okay.
And it is almost a moment by moment description of what happened. And we felt it was important for our community to know what we did, what had happened, and how we responded, and that in fact everything was fine in the end. So we had great response from that. And I will tell you, the only question I usually get asked is, Well, you paid the ransom. Why'd you pay the ransom? And then you have to walk through this idea of business continuity and time to restore and backups, whether they're good or not, and how long it takes. But that really was it, and it was overwhelmingly positive.
Great, excellent. Questions from other members before we terminate? All right, well, we're bumping into the top of the hour. Steve, I can't tell you how much I appreciate, again, your continued generosity with your time to support members of both IRHA as well as our Indiana MGMA members. You've been very helpful sharing the time. I truly hope none of our members ever experience what you went through, but I think from what they've learned today, hopefully they'll be far more prepared for that. Our members tend to be in rural areas, but I strongly urge you, just because you're in rural does not mean that you're not vulnerable. If anything else, it might make you more vulnerable, because terrorist attackers might doubt whether you have the experience to be able to withstand something like this. They might see you as even more vulnerable vis-a-vis a large urban hospital. So learn from Steve's lessons, look at the information that he's provided, and meet with your team and discuss what your responses would be. So with that, if there are no other questions, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Thank all of our participants for being with us today, and we look forward to serving you more in the future.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Westbound and ATM.